September 16, 1940, Fort Ord, California, 8:47 in the morning. Major William Harrison stands in the California mud watching something that should be impossible. 37 minutes ago, this patch of ground was empty. Now a two-story wooden barracks rises before him. Walls framed, roof trusses in place, windows being fitted into their openings. Around him, the sound of hammers creates a continuous roar like sustained artillery fire. He pulls out his pocket watch. 17 minutes to go. The construction division had promised the Secretary of War they could erect a building every 54 minutes. Harrison hadn't believed it. No one had. You don't construct a 63-man barracks, a structure measuring 172 feet long, 24 feet wide, with 2 full floors in less than an hour. That's not construction, that's assembly. But here it stands. By 9:41, crews are nailing down the last of the roofing felt. Harrison checks his watch one final time. 54 minutes, exactly. Not a barracks built in 54 minutes, a barracks every 54 minutes. Behind this one, another foundation waits. Behind that, another. Across Fort Ord's sprawling construction site, this scene repeats in parallel 30 times over. An entire company's housing materializes before lunch. This is September 1940. In 9 months, the United States Army will grow from 190,000 men to 1.4 million. In Washington, Lieutenant Colonel Brehon Somervell has just taken command of the construction division of the Quartermaster Corps, with orders to build camps for an army that doesn't yet exist, using methods that haven't been invented on a timeline that violates every principle of construction engineering. The Axis powers are watching American mobilization with amusement. Germany has conquered France in 6 weeks. America can't even house its own peacetime draft. Winter is coming, and hundreds of thousands of draftees are sleeping in tents. What Hitler doesn't know is that America's first great victory of World War II won't be won with guns. It will be won with hammers. They defeated the Axis with lumber and nails before the fighting even started. If you think these builders deserve to be remembered, please hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. It helps us keep history alive. But this miracle started with a panic. What made Fort Ord's assembly line miracle possible had started 10 months earlier in December 1939, when the reality of Europe's collapse finally penetrated the halls of the War Department. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, the United States Army ranked 17th in the world in combat power, smaller than Romania's. The entire force numbered approximately 190,000 soldiers, with barrack space for perhaps 200,000 if you counted every bunk at every installation from coast to coast. Most of these facilities dated from World War I or earlier. Many lacked central heating. Indoor plumbing was considered a modern luxury at military posts that had barely changed since the Spanish-American War. The Army's infrastructure reflected decades of neglect. Between the World Wars, Congress had slashed military budgets to Depression-era minimums. Maintenance was deferred. Expansion was unthinkable. The 9 infantry divisions that existed on paper were mostly skeletal formations, units with officer rosters but barely 3,000 enlisted men each when full strength required 15,000. The single cavalry division numbered 4,000 troopers. The mechanized brigade could field 2,300 men. This was acceptable when America had no intention of fighting. It became catastrophic in June 1940 when France fell in 44 days. France, the great military power of World War I, the nation with the finest army in Europe, protected by the supposedly impregnable Maginot Line, had collapsed like a house of cards. If France could fall in 6 weeks, what could stop Hitler from crossing the English Channel? And if Britain fell, what would prevent German U-boats from prowling the Atlantic approaches to New York and Boston? President Franklin Roosevelt faced a brutal calculation. With Britain standing alone against Nazi Germany, the United States needed an army. Not the token force of 1939, but a real military capable of defending the hemisphere, or, if necessary, joining the fight overseas. The Selective Training and Service Act, passed September 16, 1940, authorized the first peacetime conscription in American history. Young men between 21 and 35 would be drafted for 1 year of service. The initial goal? Expand the Army from 190,000 to 1.4 million within 12 months. The law promised every mother and father in America that their sons would be well housed in facilities essential to public and personal health. This wasn't sentiment, this was Roosevelt's political survival. If draftees froze in tents or fell sick in squalid camps, public support for mobilization would collapse before it began. The political calculation was razor thin. America in 1940 was deeply isolationist. The draft itself had barely passed Congress. Memories of World War I's horrific casualties still haunted the generation that would send their sons to war again. Roosevelt needed mobilization to succeed visibly and immediately before public opinion could turn against it. But the mathematics of the problem were staggering. Even if you could train 1 million men, where would you put them? The existing military posts could house perhaps 200,000 in permanent barracks and maybe another 100,000 in temporary tent camps. That left over 1 million soldiers with nowhere to sleep. And tent camps, the Army's traditional solution for temporary overflow, were political suicide. Images of American draftees shivering in canvas tents while snowstorms raged would appear on every newspaper front page in the country. The Quartermaster Corps, traditionally responsible for military construction, had already proven itself overwhelmed. In 1940, the Quartermaster's Construction Division was still using the same methods it had employed in 1917: competitive bidding for each contract, custom designs for each site, traditional construction techniques. These methods produced quality buildings. They also produced them slowly. A single cantonment using World War I methods required 8 to 12 months from groundbreaking to occupation. On December 11, 1940, General George C. Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, summoned Lieutenant Colonel Brehon Somervell to Washington and handed him an impossible task: build housing for more than 1 million men before the spring thaw. Somervell, age 48, was an odd choice for such a critical assignment. He wasn't a combat officer with battlefield credentials. He hadn't commanded troops in the Great War, at least not combat troops. His World War I service had been in logistics, building ammunition dumps at Meon-sur-Yevre, constructing the advanced depot at Is-sur-Tille. Unglamorous work, essential work, work that taught him that wars are won by supply lines as much as by soldiers. After the war, Somervell had bounced through various engineering assignments before landing what seemed like a political exile, head of the Works Progress Administration in New York City from 1936 to 1940. The WPA was a New Deal relief program, and running it meant managing 200,000 workers on Depression-era public works projects. It meant dealing with labor unions, communist organizers, left-wing artists, and budget-conscious politicians, all while actually delivering results. His crowning achievement had been LaGuardia Airport, a $45 million project that transformed 558 acres of East River marshland into a modern airfield in just over 2 years using 23,000 workers. The project required coordinating dozens of contractors, managing mountains of materials, and maintaining breakneck construction pace despite weather delays, labor disputes, and political interference. Somervell had delivered on time. General Marshall had attended the dedication ceremony in October 1939 and had been, in his own words, much impressed. Now Marshall needed that same organizational ruthlessness applied to a problem orders of magnitude larger. The Army required not one airport, but hundreds of entire camps, not in 2 years, but in 6 months. And unlike a civilian project where delays meant political embarrassment, failure here meant national catastrophe, as draftees arrived to find nowhere to sleep. Somervell accepted command of the construction division on December 11, 1940. By December 31st, he'd worked straight through Christmas studying the problem. His first act was to examine what the Quartermaster Corps had built during World War I. What he found horrified him. The Great War camps had used competitive bidding, custom designs for each site, and traditional construction methods. Every cantonment was different. Architects designed unique layouts based on terrain, climate, and local materials. Contractors submitted competing bids. The lowest bidder won. Construction followed traditional techniques. Skilled carpenters measured and cut on site. Masons laid foundations to custom specifications. Electricians and plumbers worked from hand-drawn diagrams. This approach produced fine buildings. It also produced them slowly. Building a single 40,000-man cantonment took 8 to 12 months from groundbreaking to occupation. Worse, the method scaled terribly. Building 10 cantonments didn't take 10 times as long, it took longer because skilled workers became scarcer with each new project, materials became harder to source, and experienced contractors were already committed to earlier sites. Somervell calculated the timeline. If the Army used 1917 methods to build camps for 1.4 million men, construction wouldn't finish until late 1942. By then, draftees would have been living in tents through 2 winters. The political damage would be irreparable. None of that would work now. The timeline was too compressed, the scale too vast, the political stakes too high. Somervell did something unprecedented. He threw out competitive bidding. He threw out custom designs. He threw out everything that made construction slow and started over with a single question: how do you build a city in 6 months? His answer would revolutionize military construction. In early January 1941, as the first draftees began arriving at induction centers, Somervell convened a construction advisory committee at a Fort Myers warehouse in Virginia. He pulled in John Hogan, president of the American Society of Civil Engineers, Stephen Voorhees, past president of the American Institute of Architects, Alonzo Hammond, president of the American Engineering Council, Malcolm Pierney, general chairman of the Construction League of America. These weren't military men. They were the country's top civilian construction minds, and Somervell needed them to solve a problem that traditional Army thinking couldn't crack. The solution they developed was deceptively simple: treat construction like manufacturing. Henry Ford had revolutionized automobile production by building the first moving assembly line in 1913. Every Model T that rolled off the line was identical. Every component was standardized. Workers specialized in single tasks, repeating them with increasing speed and precision. A chassis moved past worker after worker, each adding one component. No skilled craftsmen building entire cars, just specialized workers executing simple, repetitive tasks. Why couldn't you build barracks the same way? The Construction Advisory Committee spent 3 weeks locked in the Fort Myers warehouse working around the clock. They had one mandate: create a construction system that could house 1 million men in 6 months using unskilled labor and standardized materials. Everything else, architectural beauty, customization to local conditions, traditional craftsmanship, was secondary. The team revived and radically updated the 700 series plans, standardized blueprints originally designed by the Quartermaster Corps in 1928 but never fully implemented. The original 700 series had been a half measure, standardized dimensions but still allowing for local modifications and custom details. Somervell's team stripped away every unnecessary variable. By late January 1941, they'd produced a complete set of drawings covering more than 300 building types: barracks, mess halls, headquarters buildings, latrines, hospitals, warehouses, recreation halls, storage sheds, guardhouses, administrative offices. Every structure was modular, every measurement was standardized, every component was designed for prefabrication. The blueprint specified not just dimensions, but exact material quantities. A site commander didn't order enough lumber for 10 barracks. He ordered 47,200 board feet of 2x4 studs, 12,800 board feet of 2x6 floor joists, 4,200 square feet of plywood sheathing, all pre-cut to specification. Plan number 700-1165 became the template for everything that followed. The standard 2-story enlisted men's barracks. Dimensions: 172 feet long, 24 feet wide, 20 feet to the roof line. Capacity, 63 men, 1 full platoon. Construction, wood frame with weatherboard siding nailed to diagonal sheathing. Foundation, concrete piers set on 8-foot centers. Roof, gable design with 4 to 12 pitch, steep enough to shed rain, shallow enough for unskilled workers to frame without calculating complex angles. Heating, coal-fired furnace in the basement with hot water radiators in every room. Plumbing, indoor latrines with 6 toilets, 6 sinks, and 6 shower heads. Shared facilities that could serve 63 men on a rotating schedule. This was luxury compared to tent camps. World War I soldiers had used outdoor latrines and bathed from buckets. The 700 series barracks offered central heating, running water, flush toilets, and hot showers. These weren't just amenities, they were disease prevention. The 1918 influenza pandemic had killed 675,000 Americans. Many of them soldiers packed into crowded, unsanitary camps. Roosevelt had promised mothers their sons would be well housed. This meant housing that didn't kill them. The architectural feature that distinguished 700 series buildings was the aqua media, a protective overhang above first-floor windows that allowed ventilation even during rainstorms. This simple detail solved a persistent problem. Hot, crowded barracks with 63 men sleeping in double-deck bunks generated tremendous body heat. Without ventilation, temperatures became unbearable and respiratory infections spread. But traditional windows, when opened during rainstorms, created puddles that ruined wooden floors and created slip hazards. The aqua media allowed windows to stay open regardless of weather. Fresh air flowed, soldiers stayed healthy. But the real genius wasn't in the architecture, it was in the execution method. Traditional construction moved sequentially. You built one foundation, then framed one building, raised one roof, finished one structure. Then you moved to the next. A 20-man crew might take 3 weeks to complete a single barracks working this way. Somerville's team redesigned the process into specialized crews operating in parallel. One crew, the foundation team, did nothing but lay out and pour concrete piers. They moved from site to site, marking locations with surveying equipment, digging pier holes, setting forms, pouring concrete. They completed 20 foundations in the time a traditional crew completed 1 building. Behind them came the framing crew. These workers did nothing but assemble wall frames. Floor joists arrived pre-cut to 24-foot lengths. Wall studs arrived pre-cut to 8-foot heights with pre-drilled holes for electrical conduits. Workers didn't measure anything. They didn't calculate anything. They assembled pre-cut components like erector sets. A wall frame went up in minutes, not hours. The roof crew followed. Trusses arrived pre-assembled from mills. Workers hoisted them into place with block and tackle, bolted them to wall plates, and nailed roof decking. No angle calculations, no complex carpentry, just repetitive assembly work. Windows and doors arrived pre-hung in frames. The installation crew didn't build doors, they bolted complete door assemblies into standardized openings. A skilled carpenter might spend half a day hanging a door properly, getting the clearances right, ensuring smooth operation. An unskilled worker with pre-hung units could install 10 doors in the same time. Electrical crews ran wiring through those pre-drilled conduit holes in wall studs. Every barracks followed identical electrical plans. Light fixtures in the same locations, switch boxes at standardized heights, outlets at uniform spacing. The electrician didn't design anything. He followed a color-coded diagram that a high school student could read. Plumbing crews worked from equally standardized plans. Every latrine had identical layouts, 6 toilets, 6 sinks, 6 showers, always in the same configuration. Pipes ran in exposed chases rather than hidden in walls. If something leaked, you could see it and fix it without demolishing plaster. Each crew became expert at one task. They worked with identical materials at identical measurements on identical plans. There was no learning curve after the first few buildings, no customization, no decisions to make. The first barracks took days to assemble. The 10th took hours. By the 50th, crews moved with mechanical precision. Materials arrived pre-cut from sawmills across the country. Lumber companies received specifications for 700 Series Package A, complete materials for one standard barracks. They didn't bid on custom requirements. They filled standardized orders. A mill in Oregon cut the same 2x4 studs as a mill in Georgia. Quality was uniform. Delivery was predictable. Windows came pre-assembled from factories. Doors arrived with hinges already mounted, hardware already installed. Roofing felt came in pre-measured rolls. Every nail, every screw, every bolt was delivered in exact quantities needed for each building type. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was improvised. Nothing required on-site decision-making. The construction division awarded contracts on a cost-plus fixed-fee basis rather than competitive bidding. Contractors were reimbursed for actual material and labor costs plus a predetermined management fee, typically 5 to 7% of total costs. This removed the incentive to cut corners or underbid competitors. Speed mattered more than price. Quality mattered more than profit margins. If a camp could be finished a month early, it was worth paying premium rates for that speed. This was radical in 1941. Government contracts had always gone to the lowest bidder. Competition was supposed to control costs, but Somerville understood that competitive bidding created perverse incentives. Low-ball bids led to corner cutting. Contractors fought change orders. Quality suffered. Delays mounted. Cost-plus contracts aligned incentives. Contractors made their fee regardless of final price, so they had no reason to compromise quality. The Army paid actual costs, so contractors had no reason to inflate bids. Everyone's interest was the same: finish quickly, build well, move to the next project. By March 1941, the system was proving itself across the country. Camp Edwards in Massachusetts became the first large-scale test. Between September and December 1940, contractors erected 471 buildings using the new methods. The camp sprawled across Massachusetts' coastline, thousands of acres transformed from empty land to functional military base in 4 months. Camp Blanding in Florida became the showcase for what standardized construction could achieve at massive scale. The site covered 30,000 acres of Clay County pine forest near the small town of Stark, population 2,500. Original plans in 1939 called for housing 1 infantry regiment, perhaps 3,000 men. By early 1940, as Europe collapsed, those plans expanded to accommodate 1 full division, 15,000 soldiers. By the end of 1940, capacity had grown again to support 2 complete divisions plus support elements, over 40,000 men. Construction at Camp Blanding began in August 1940 and continued through 1941. At its peak, 32,000 construction workers swarmed the site, more workers than there were residents in Stark. These weren't local laborers. They were migrants from across the South and Midwest, drawn by the promise of government wages during the Depression's lingering tail end. They lived in hastily erected worker camps, ate in mess tents, and labored in shifts from sunrise to well past dark under floodlights. By late 1941, Camp Blanding had become Florida's 4th largest city. Population 55,000 soldiers housed in 10,000 buildings connected by 125 miles of paved roads. The camp had its own hospital, the largest in the state with over 1,000 beds, its own water treatment plant, its own power generation station, its own fire department, police force, and post office. This wasn't a temporary campsite. This was an instant city built from nothing in 14 months. Over the course of the war, 745,000 soldiers would rotate through Camp Blanding for training. Infantry divisions trained there before shipping to Europe and the Pacific. Specialized units, rangers, combat engineers, amphibious assault troops honed skills there. German prisoners of war were held there after North Africa and Italy campaigns. And it all started with standardized blueprints and unskilled workers following simple, repetitive instructions. By spring 1941, the construction template perfected at Camp Edwards and Camp Blanding was being replicated nationwide. Fort Ord in California, Fort Benning in Georgia, Camp Shelby in Mississippi, Fort Dix in New Jersey, Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri. Every camp followed identical construction methods. Local terrain varied, climate differed, but the buildings were the same, the process was the same, the results were the same. By June 1941, Somerville's construction division had built 50 major camps, 9 hospitals, 45 munitions plants, and 28 troop reception centers, enough housing to accommodate 1.2 million soldiers. Total construction value, $1.8 billion. This at a time when the entire federal budget for 1940 had been $9.6 billion. The lumber industry struggled to keep pace. Sawmills across the Pacific Northwest, the South, and the Great Lakes region ran triple shifts. Mills that had been operating at 30% capacity during Depression years suddenly couldn't produce fast enough. By mid-1941, 90% of lumber orders placed with American mills were connected to defense projects, cantonments, airfields, Navy facilities, munitions factories, shipyards. The demand was insatiable. Prices rose sharply throughout 1940 and 1941. What had been a depression-stalled industry suddenly faced the opposite problem, more orders than capacity. Mills hired workers, logging camps expanded, railroads added lumber cars to handle shipping demand. Still, the materials kept flowing because Somervell had prioritized logistics from the beginning. Railroads delivered pre-cut lumber directly to construction sites in dedicated freight cars. The Army didn't wait for materials to arrive. They stockpiled weeks in advance. Warehouses at each campsite held reserves of critical components. If a sawmill shipment was delayed, construction continued using stockpiled materials while new orders were expedited. This redundancy came from Somervell's WPA experience. LaGuardia Airport had taught him that construction delays were usually supply chain failures, not labor shortages. Keep materials flowing ahead of need, and workers never stood idle. But the real bottleneck wasn't materials. It was skilled labor, or rather it would have been if the system had required skilled labor. In late summer 1940, a crisis threatened to derail the entire program. Somervell's assembly line method required thousands of carpenters, electricians, plumbers, and laborers. But America was still climbing out of the Great Depression. Skilled construction workers were scarce. Those who existed were already employed on defense projects or private contracts. The solution, once again, was to treat construction like manufacturing, de-skill the work. Traditional carpentry required years of apprenticeship. A journeyman carpenter could read blueprints, calculate angles, work with complex joints. Somerville's system didn't need craftsmen. It needed assemblers. The 700 series plans were deliberately simplified. Roof pitches were standardized at 412, simple enough for inexperienced workers to frame without calculating angles. Wall studs were placed at uniform 16-inch intervals. Floor joists were identical across all buildings. Connections used the minimum number of nails required for structural integrity. Fewer nails meant less skilled labor and faster assembly. Stock doors and windows arrived pre-hung. Workers didn't install doors, they bolted pre-assembled door units into standardized openings. Electrical wiring followed color-coded diagrams that required no electrical expertise to follow. Plumbing ran in exposed chases. If a pipe leaked, you could see it and fix it without tearing into walls. The construction division trained workers in days, not years. You learned to frame walls. That's all. You framed walls on building 1, then building 2, then building 20. By building 50, you could frame a wall section faster than any traditional carpenter because you'd done nothing else for weeks. This was the breakthrough that made Fort Ord's 54-minute barracks possible. The construction wasn't slower because workers were unskilled, it was faster because workers were specialized, and specialization meant speed. At Camp Blanding, those 32,000 migrant workers weren't experienced builders. They were unemployed laborers, many still feeling the Depression's bite. The opportunity to work for government wages, steady, reliable pay, drew workers from as far away as the Midwest. The construction division turned them into precision assembly crews in a matter of days. By spring 1941, Somervell had built a construction army larger than many nations' actual armies. Tens of thousands of workers operated like precision machinery across hundreds of sites. The rhythm was relentless. Foundation crews worked sunrise to sunset. Framing crews started at dawn. Roofing crews finished under floodlights. The system had one more advantage: flexibility. When the Army decided Camp Blanding needed to expand from 1 division to 2, the construction division didn't redraw plans. They doubled the order. 200 more barracks, 30 more mess halls, 4 more headquarters buildings. The crews already knew how to build them. Materials were already standardized. The expansion took weeks, not months. When pearl-handled pistol enthusiasts from 3rd Army complained that their headquarters building's windows were too small, Somerville's staff checked the 700 series catalog. Standard window Type C replaced standard window Type B. 3 days, no architectural drawings, no contractor negotiations. On January 29, 1941, Somerville was promoted to Brigadier General, a temporary rank that reflected the urgency of his mission. By June 1941, his construction division had built housing for more than 1 million men in facilities superior to those of any army in history. But the real test was still coming. The Cantonment Construction Program succeeded because it embodied a uniquely American approach to problem-solving: standardization over craftsmanship, speed over perfection, industrial scale over artisanal quality. This wasn't how European armies thought about construction. German military engineers prided themselves on robust, permanent facilities built to last decades. The Wehrmacht's barracks were solid brick structures with tile roofs and stone foundations, buildings that could serve as hospitals, schools, or administrative centers in peacetime. British cantonments in India were architectural monuments to imperial prestige, designed to impress colonized populations with the permanence of British power. Japanese military construction emphasized local materials and traditional methods, reflecting cultural values of harmony with the environment. American military construction in 1940 to 1941 embraced the opposite philosophy: build it fast, build it cheap, build it good enough. The 700 series barracks weren't beautiful. They were simple wood-frame structures with minimal ornamentation. The Aqua Medea overhangs served a function, not an aesthetic. Interiors were Spartan, open bays with rows of metal bunks, communal latrines, coal stoves. Nothing was permanent. Everything was temporary. This temporariness was deliberate. The Army didn't know how long the war would last, didn't know if troops would train stateside for 6 months or 2 years. Building permanent brick barracks would take too long and cost too much, but temporary wooden structures could be erected in weeks and, if necessary, dismantled or repurposed after the war. The philosophy extended to every decision. When concrete shortages threatened to slow foundation work, the construction division switched to concrete piers rather than continuous foundations, faster to pour, requiring less material. When steel became scarce, they used wooden support beams. When skilled electricians couldn't be found, they designed electrical systems simple enough for laborers to install following color-coded diagrams. Every choice prioritized one thing: getting soldiers out of tents and into heated barracks before winter. The Selective Service Act had mandated that no draftee could be sworn into service unless the government could provide adequate housing. This wasn't just about comfort, it was about disease. During World War I, more American soldiers died from influenza at stateside camps than were killed in combat overseas. Crowded conditions, poor sanitation, inadequate heating, these killed men as surely as German machine guns. The 700 series barracks eliminated those risks. Central heating meant soldiers didn't freeze. Indoor plumbing meant disease didn't spread through contaminated water. Adequate spacing between buildings meant respiratory infections didn't leap from barracks to barracks. The Aqua Medea ventilation system kept air flowing even during storms, reducing the respiratory infections that thrived in stuffy, overcrowded spaces. These were minimum standards, but minimum standards, applied at massive scale with ruthless consistency, saved lives. Somervell understood something his military contemporaries didn't: logistics beats tactics. You couldn't win a war with soldiers who never reached the battlefield because they froze to death in training camps. You couldn't project power overseas if your mobilization collapsed from political backlash over inadequate facilities. You couldn't maintain public support for a war if mothers saw photographs of their sons shivering in tents while the government claimed to be prepared. The Cantonment Program wasn't glamorous. No one would write songs about carpenters hammering nails at Fort Ord. Historians would focus on battles, generals, weapons. But without those carpenters, there would be no army. Without that army, there would be no D-Day, no liberation of Europe, no victory. The philosophy was simple: build the foundation first. Everything else follows. The Cantonment Construction Program success rippled far beyond housing soldiers. By mid-1941, the construction division had proven that American industry could accomplish the impossible when properly organized. This lesson would echo through every subsequent mobilization challenge of World War II. When the Navy needed shipyards expanded to build Liberty ships at scale, they borrowed Somervell's methods: standardized designs, prefabricated components, specialized work crews. Henry Kaiser's shipyards in Richmond, California, reduced Liberty ship construction time from 230 days to 42 days using assembly line techniques pioneered at Army cantonments. The same principles: break complex tasks into simple steps, specialize workers, prefabricate components, eliminate customization. When the Army Air Corps needed airfields across the Pacific, they deployed the same approach: standardized plans, modular construction, rapid deployment. Engineers could transform a coral atoll into a functional bomber base in weeks. Airstrips appeared on Guadalcanal, Saipan, Iwo Jima, each using variations of the same construction manual. The steel matting for runways came in standardized sections. Control towers followed standard blueprints. Fuel depots used prefabricated tanks. Everything was designed for speed and replicability. When the Manhattan Project needed facilities at Oak Ridge and Hanford, construction followed cantonment principles: cost-plus contracts, standardized components, specialized crews. The difference was secrecy, not method. The human cost of not having this system would have been catastrophic. If cantonment construction had followed traditional methods, custom designs, competitive bidding, craftsmanship over speed, the housing shortage would have persisted into 1942. Draftees would have trained in tents through winter. Disease would have swept through camps as it had in 1918. Pneumonia, influenza, meningitis, these killed vulnerable populations in crowded, cold, unsanitary conditions. Public support for mobilization would have fractured as casualty lists from stateside camps appeared in hometown newspapers. Instead, by December 1941, when Pearl Harbor transformed America's peacetime draft into total war mobilization, the infrastructure was already in place. Camps that had been built for 300,000 men could expand to accommodate millions. The construction expertise developed in 1940-1941 could be replicated anywhere at any scale. Communities near military installations experienced profound transformations. Stark, Florida's population exploded from 2,500 to over 30,000 as construction workers and military personnel flooded in. Local infrastructure, roads, water systems, sewage, strained under the sudden demand. But those workers spent wages in local businesses, reviving depression-battered economies. Stores that had barely survived the 1930s suddenly couldn't keep shelves stocked. Restaurants served customers around the clock. Housing construction boomed as workers' families followed. After the war, many of those workers remained. They'd learned skills: carpentry, electrical work, plumbing, that translated into civilian careers. The GI Bill would educate millions of veterans, but the construction boom of 1940-1941 educated hundreds of thousands of workers before the first shot was fired. Men who'd been unemployed in 1939 became skilled tradesmen in 1941. They built homes in post-war suburbs. They started construction companies. They trained the next generation. The camps themselves became functioning communities, not temporary way stations, but cities with hospitals, libraries, post offices, theaters, athletic fields. Soldiers trained there for months. Officers commanded there for years. Civilian staff, cooks, clerks, medical personnel lived there indefinitely. Base commanders governed populations larger than most American cities. They dealt with sewage systems, fire departments, police forces, electrical grids, all built from nothing in months. Camp Blanding remained operational through 1945, housing and training 750,000 soldiers. After the war, most buildings were dismantled by the Army Wrecking Corporation and sold as surplus. Some became barns on Florida farms. Others were moved intact and repurposed as schools or storage facilities. A few still stand today, weathered but recognizable. 700 series construction identifiable by the aqua media overhangs. The camp's legacy wasn't the buildings, it was the proof of concept. America could mobilize at scale, could organize chaos into production, could transform impossibility into routine, could take an engineering problem that conventional wisdom said required years and solve it in months. This would define American power for the next 80 years. By December 1941, the Cantonment Construction Program had achieved the following: construction output, 50 major military installations completed, 28 troop reception centers erected, 9 hospitals built, 45 munitions plants constructed, total construction value $1.8 billion, approximately $35 billion in 2024 dollars. Housing capacity created, 1.3 million soldiers. Timeline: program initiated December 1940. First camps operational March 1941. Primary construction phase 18 months, mid-1940 through late 1941. Construction speed record: 1 complete barracks every 54 minutes at Fort Ord. Workforce and scale: estimated peak construction workforce over 100,000 workers simultaneously employed across all sites. Camp Blanding workforce, 32,000 construction workers at peak. Camp Blanding final population, 55,000 soldiers, Florida's 4th largest city during war. Camp Blanding total trainees, 745,000 personnel rotated through during World War II. Camp Blanding infrastructure, 10,000 buildings, 125 miles paved roads, and a 1,000-bed hospital. Materials and logistics: lumber demand by mid-1941, 90% of all U.S. sawmill orders defense-related. Construction method: cost plus fixed fee contracts, 5 to 7% contractor fees. Standard barracks dimensions: 172 feet long, 24 feet wide, 20 feet high. Standard barracks capacity: 63 men per building. Post-program expansion: by 1943, over 6 million soldiers housed using cantonment construction methods. Total installations using 700-800 series construction, over 250 sites nationwide. Peak wartime Army strength, 8.3 million soldiers, 1945. The Cantonment Construction Program never appeared in victory parades. Carpenters didn't receive medals for hammering nails at twice normal speed. Somervell's name never joined MacArthur's or Eisenhower's in popular memory, yet this forgotten mobilization miracle enabled everything that followed. When American forces landed at Normandy in June 1944, those soldiers had trained in cantonments built by Somervell's construction division. When B-17s bombed German factories, their pilots had learned to fly at airfields constructed using assembly line methods. When Liberty ships ferried supplies across the Atlantic, they'd been built in shipyards that borrowed cantonment construction principles. When the atomic bomb ended the war in August 1945, the scientists who built it had worked at facilities erected with standardized designs and prefabricated components. The lesson echoed through American industrial mobilization. Organization trumps resources. The United States in 1940 didn't have more steel than Germany, didn't have superior military tradition, didn't have battle-hardened troops. What America had was the ability to organize, to standardize, to turn impossible timelines into routine deadlines, to build cities in months and transform unemployed laborers into precision assembly crews, to throw out conventional wisdom when conventional wisdom meant failure. This became America's secret weapon, not a bomb or a tank, but the capacity to mobilize faster and at larger scale than any nation in history. The Axis powers looked at America's 190,000-man army in 1939 and saw weakness. They were right about the Army's size. They were catastrophically wrong about America's capacity to change that. The principles established in 1940-1941 would define military construction for generations. Today's forward operating bases in remote theaters still use modular construction, prefabricated components, and standardized designs. When the U.S. military deploys to a new region, they don't start from scratch. They reference catalogs of standardized building types, order pre-cut components, and assemble structures using specialized crews. The DNA of the 700 series barracks lives on in every rapid deployment facility the military erects. When humanitarian crises require instant shelter, refugee camps, disaster relief, emergency hospitals, the response follows cantonment principles: standardized designs, prefabricated components, specialized assembly crews. The United Nations and international NGOs learned from Somervell's playbook. Speed saves lives. Standardization enables speed. But perhaps the program's greatest legacy is simpler. It proved that America's strength wasn't inherent, it was organizational. Give the nation an impossible task, a compressed timeline, and the political will to succeed, and American industry would find a way. Not through superior craftsmanship, not through technological advantage, through ruthless organization and industrial-scale thinking. By the time the Axis powers realized their error, American carpenters had already won the war's first battle, not with bullets but with blueprints, not through valor but through industrial precision, not by building better but by building faster than anyone thought possible. In September 1940, at Fort Ord, California, Major William Harrison watched a barracks rise in 54 minutes and knew he was witnessing something unprecedented. He was watching America prepare for total war by doing what America does best: taking an impossible problem and industrializing the solution. The Cantonment Construction Program housed 1.3 million men in 18 months. That army would grow to 8.3 million by 1945. It would fight on 5 continents. It would help liberate Europe and defeat Japan. But none of that happens without the carpenters. None of that happens without the blueprints. None of that happens without a construction officer who understood that logistics beats tactics, organization beats chaos, and sometimes the most important victory is the one nobody notices. The Axis never saw it coming.